Found this old newspaper article, and I wanted to read it because I don't see any versions of the text online. Problem is, I got the font really small. It's just very difficult to read, so bear with me. I might stumble a bit, but if you like this topic, then hopefully it'll be worth listening to. Now, the newspaper was the St. Louis Republic, and the Sunday magazine was the publication. Sunday Magazine of the St. Louis Republic, December 11th, 1904, and the author is John H. Peters. Voyages in Midget Boats by John H. Peters. The summer of 1904 was almost the first in 40 years in which an attempt was not made by some lone voyager to cross the Atlantic in a small boat. Perhaps the previous season had exhausted the crop of availables, for then no fewer than 4 attempted the feat, although only one was successful. This craze for transoceanic travel, in such comfortless form, is not the least curious feature of maritime daring and contempt of danger. It is chiefly evident about Gloucester, Massachusetts, the seat of the New England deep-sea fisheries. Nearly all of the freak mariners hail from Gloucester, acquired their handiness in seamanship among the Grand Banks fleet, and learned to discount the ocean's rages in the turbulent waters off Newfoundland. So acute did the passion for dory voyaging become in New England latterly that preachers and the pressmen were forced to unite in denouncing it, and did their best to discourage its spread, fearing that ships would disregard genuine castaways in the belief that they were of the fraternity of dory cranks. Somewhat of the halo that attached to the man who first swam Niagara was reflected upon the earliest lone voyages. But of late, public interest in both forms of foolhardy adventures has palled. The first Argonaut to cross the Atlantic was exhibited by Barnum at a big salary, but the last found none to do him homage, and having to sell his boat to his disgust, was forced to return to America a few months ago as a steerage steward on the steamship Croonland. The reader unaccustomed to seafaring life can have no idea of the intrepidity of these men. To embark alone on a lengthy cruise in a little cockle shell is a test of courage that few are called upon to undertake, for they have to face the ocean in its wildest rages, battle against storms without food, rest, or sleep, remain for weeks and months deprived of human companionship, and constantly facing the knowledge that if mishap befalls, there is no prospect of escape. It is a point of honor with these mariners to go in as small a craft as possible, and rarely in 3 times the length of her occupant, a frail skiff, with a slight decking, a couple of masts, spread to her tiny sails on, tanks for food and water fore and aft, in a quote-unquote cabin amidships where the occupant may rest when wind and sea will allow him a brief relaxation from the eternal vigilance which in this pursuit at any rate is certainly the price of success. In 1864 the yawl Vision with 1 man attempted a voyage from New York to London, but after speaking a steamer off the Grand Banks and receiving provisions was never heard of again. 2 years later the dory Red, White, and Blue, carrying John Hudson and Francis Fitch, made the same trip in 38 days. In 1867 the Nonpareil, with 3 men, Mikes, Miller, and Lawson, crossed from Gloucester to Southampton in 51 days. In 1868 the skiff John T. Ford, with William Marshall and Albert French, got from Baltimore to within sight of the Irish coast, and there it was capsized. Marshall drowned with her. French was rescued by a passing vessel. The sloop Benson sailed from Liverpool to Boston in 1870 in 98 days, and returned the following summer from New York to Queenstown in 49 days. The first human being to cross the Atlantic alone was Alfred Johnson, in the dory Centennial in 1876, from Gloucester to Liverpool. The boat was only 16 feet long, and made the voyage in 67 days. Johnson had many adventures, one being through the capsizing of the tiny craft in a heavy sea. But he righted her again, though a big shark chased him, which he finally drove off with a long knife attached to a pole. He was only 29 years old, and his feat was regarded as an amazing one, as he was honored throughout England, where he remained until the next spring, and then on returning was exhibited by Barnum at the aquarium in New York. But Johnson was satisfied with his solitary experience and declared that nothing could tempt him to make another trip. Shortly after Johnson, another boat, the Brittle, navigated by Fred Madison, essayed the voyage from New York to Liverpool, but after being spoken in mid-ocean, vanished from human knowledge. Women even have tried this amazing adventure. In 1887, Captain Thomas Crapo and wife sailed from New Bedford in a dory, and 49 days later reached Penzance, Cornwall, after making an eventful trip. The next wedded pair were Captain Lewis Goldsmith and wife, who sailed from Gloucester to England in the boat Uncle Sam, and after a terrible experience were taken off their sinking craft by passing steamship 3 days after leaving St. John's, when she was making her final departure. Another man and wife whose fate was most melancholy were Captain William Andrews and bride, who sailed from Atlantic City in 1901 in the boat Dark Street to cross the Atlantic as a honeymoon trip. They intended to touch it at the Azores, but never made it there, and must have been overwhelmed by some storm. Andrews had already acquired a reputation as an ocean voyager, and his brother in 1878 built a 15 to visit the Paris Exposition of that year, reaching Havre in 62 days after a voyage attended by great privations. 11 years later, Andrews himself tried to duplicate this perilous Atlantic trip in a boat of similar size, but this time he did not get more than 150 miles from land, being buffeted about by storms for a month, before he was rescued by his tempest-beaten skiff by a passing schooner. Afterward, another ocean waif named Lawlor challenged him to race across the herring pond, and a purse of $2,000 was raised. Andrews met adverse fortune from the start, and after having had his boat upset 5 times and being reduced to the verge of starvation, was eventually compelled to abandon the trip. Lawlor was more fortunate and landed in Cornwall in 57 days. Subsequently, they tried again, and Andrews was ferried across to Portugal by favoring breezes within a month, while Lawlor was never reported. It was his last voyage, and the same fate befell Andrews on his next attempt. The most famous of all the deep-sea vagabonds is Howard Blackburn, the fingerless fisherman, so called because he possesses only the stumps of his fingers. The life story of this daring mariner is so extraordinary as to be almost incredible, as if he did not exist in the flesh to confirm it. 20 years ago, while fishing on the Newfoundland banks, and a comrade, Walsh, went adrift in their dory. Walsh died of exposure, but Blackburn was cast in heroic mold. For 5 days and nights rowed shoreward without food or drink until he reached the coast. Though his hands were frozen in form, they gripped the paddles, causing the loss of his fingers, and he was several months helpless, as his toes were also affected. Yet despite this digital disability, the worst that could afflict a man who follows the sea as a calling, Blackburn has achieved an amazing record in marine adventure, crossing the Atlantic successfully twice, cruising down through the canals and lakes and along the seaboard of the eastern states, and attempting a third Atlantic voyage in 1903, which failed, however. The marvel is that a man so hampered should venture to see it all, and this feeling must be intensified by remembering On none of his trips has he had any human aid whatever, relying on his own maimed hands to row, steer, set and stow sails, cook, and do the multitudinous duties such as undertaking calls for daily. On June 18, 1890, 17 years after his mishap on the Grand Banks, he sailed from Gloucester, Massachusetts, for Gloucester, England, in the sloop Great Western, arriving at his destination August 19th, some 62 days later. His voyage was attended with a share of hardships, and he suffered more on account of his maimed condition. His plan to warn oncoming ships of his presence was to hoist 2 lanterns to his masthead, and as other crafts could not understand this signal, they would give him a wide berth while he slumbered peacefully in his little cabin. He was treated royally at Gloucester, after having had an amusing encounter with the superintendent of the docks there. Quote, "You cannot bring your boat in here," declared that official, as Blackburn sought to nurse her to a secure mooring. "Why?" retorted her owner. "Is she too big?" "No," was the reply. "She's too small." "Well," rejoined Blackburn, "what's your limit?" "She will not take up much room that she'll crowd out any liner." 2 years later, June 9, 1901, he sailed again from his home in the sloop Great Republic for Lisbon, which he reached July 18th after a passage of 39 days. On May 18th, 1902, he began a 9-month cruise through the inland and coastwise waters, using the same sloop, Great Republic, the greater part of the way. Sailing from Gloucester to New York, he worked down the Hudson River, Erie Canal, and Great Lakes to Chicago, thence through the Illinois and Michigan canals and the Mississippi River to Columbus, Kentucky, whence he shipped his boat by rail to Mobile, and from there sailed through the Gulf of Mexico to Biscayne Bay, where he sold a sloop and purchased a rowboat, in which he made his way to Jacksonville, thence returning to New York by steamer. Reaching his home in February 1903, the spirit of adventure inflamed him again, and on June 8th of the same year he left Gloucester in the 16-foot dory America, bound for Havre, Gibraltar, back across the Atlantic to Florida, thence up the Mississippi to St. Louis, where he intended to exhibit her at the fair. The America was his smallest boat, and he met adverse fortune from the start. In a storm, his boat was flooded, and he was nearly drowned while asleep below. He escaped the worst, but his provisions being spoiled, had to make Clark's Harbor to refit. After sailing again, he met a similar mishap, and wettings and exposure brought on rheumatism, so he abandoned the voyage and returned home. For as he put it, quote, "A polar bear could not stand such hardships much longer." His successful competitor that year, Ludwig Eisenbraun, a German, was driven back in his first attempt, leaving Boston May 22nd in the 17-foot dory Columbia. He kept out for 19 days, during which time he covered 350 miles, but was forced to put back, spent from fatigue and rheumatism, and landed at Rockport June 13th. Undismayed by this, he started again, August 11th, in a boat 2 foot longer, named Columbia II. Accompanied as far as Halifax, Nova Scotia, by Charles Shoes, who was planning a similar single-handed trip himself, and went thus far to gain experience. It was fortunate for Eisenbraun that he did so, for by crossing Fundy Bay, the little craft was swept by a heavy sea which filled the cockpit and washed him overboard, though he, being a good swimmer, managed to regain the boat with the help of his mate. Leaving Halifax on August 25th alone for Gibraltar, Eisenbraun was not reported in 37 days, when the British steamer Greenbrier helped him and gave him provisions in mid-ocean. He put into Madeira October 26 after 72 days en route, and after overhauling and refitting his boat, continued on for Gibraltar, reaching there November 20th after a voyage of 101 days. He was in good health and spirits, though he had not escaped his share of adventures. On September 5th, during a heavy gale, which hove to with a sea anchor out, its bridle broke, the boat fell off and was pooped by a sea, carrying out off his rudder, tiller, sea anchor, and the watch he used for navigation, and spoiling his provisions so that he lost everything but hope. Quote unquote, everything but hope. Those are his own words. As he entered it into his log. 4 days later, a steamer bound for Gibraltar supplied him with stores and a 90-cent watch to replace the other. The next week, another ship spoke him, tried to induce him to abandon his voyage, and when he refused, gave him water and food. On October 10th, while taking a short nap, his boat collided with a sleeping whale, but luckily he escaped with only a ducking. Eisenbraun claims that the voyage was not lonely or depressing, but that he found abundant occupation and contentment. Frequently, he welcomed storms, as he could then take in sail and set his sea anchor, crawled into the little covered space he called his cabin, closed the hatch behind him, and sleep comfortably. Nor had he any fear of accident, recognizing the wide expanse of ocean, how tiny a speck his craft formed upon it. His voyage having been broken at Madeira cannot be considered so great an achievement as Blackburn's, especially in view of the latest physical limitations and infirmities. Blackburn certainly stands unequaled as a dory voyager. The others who essayed the voyage in 1903 were Joseph Chavres, a Portuguese-American, Chavres, Chavres, and William Schneider, a German-American. The former, like Blackburn, has one of his hands crippled, the work of an insane comrade on a fishing vessel. He left Boston June 26th in a 20-foot dory, Portugal, but after gaining 240 miles, he returned, declaring that his boat was not fast enough. Schneider was in a 15-foot dory and was rescued from her on the banks by the fishing schooner Procyon, Procyon, after having been 3 weeks at sea and making little progress. Rarely is the run from England to America attempted, though there was one conspicuous instance in this, the Little Weston, which sailed from Gloucester, Massachusetts in 1880, and I can't see it, 1880 I think it is, and arrived at Cowes, Isle of Wight, 46 days later, manned by George Thomas and Fred Norman, returning again the next year from London to Gloucester in 62 days. She was the only American boat up to that time to make the Atlantic voyage in both directions, and her doing so was made an occasion of great rejoicing by the thousands of shellbacks which resided along the New England seaboard. The transatlantic traveler who sees the tiny fabrics tossing on the choppy swell of the Grand Banks, with their hardy occupants fishing, while the parent barks lie within easy reach, marvels at how they can live through the gales that smite them. But perilous as their plight is, it can be nothing compared to that of the marine wanderer who deliberately sets out to cross the ocean, subjects himself to every hardship and discomfort, having scarcely room to move, and living for weeks with only a thin beard between him and eternity. From the narratives of those who meet misfortune on these skiffs, and are rescued, it is easy to understand what suffering must be endured by those who fare still worse, while their boats become crippled and unmanageable, their food spoiled and water salted. Their boats start leaking, and they begin a desperate, unequal fight to keep afloat, hoping against hope for rescue, until with flagging energies and despondent spirits they wait for the doom that all too surely overwhelms them. Considering the hardships associated in marine circles with rounding the Horn, perhaps one of the most foolhardy of ocean voyages was that of the boat Golden Gate, 19 feet long, which in 1879 attempted the trip from Boston around Cape Horn to San Francisco. She was manned by Herbert Beryl and Andrew Cone of Nantucket, but they experienced such misadventures they landed on the Brazil coast and abandoned the attempt. Although the Atlantic has been the scene of most of these temerarious voyages, other oceans have not been without their quota. Everybody is familiar with the story of Captain Joshua Slocum, who in April 1895 started from Boston, cruised around the world in the 40-foot yawl Spray, built by himself, returning to Boston in June 1898, having covered a total of 46,000 miles in the interim. He had been emboldened to this by the fact that, some few years previously, when the ship he commanded was wrecked off the coast of Chile, he built a small craft from the wreckage and sailed her around Cape Horn and up the Atlantic to New York, a distance of 7,000 miles. Captain Voss, a Canadian in British Columbia, determined to outdo Slocum's record, and in May 1901 started with one companion named Begent to sail around the world in an Alaska Indian war canoe. She was hollowed out of solid cedar tree 40 years ago by the Indians and weighed only 2.5 tons. In the South Pacific, Begent was washed overboard, but Voss secured another assistant at Cape Town, and after calling at Ponta Delgada, Azores, succeeded in reaching London September 12th of the year, having covered over 40,000 miles of the long journey up to this time. 2 men named Napper and Langford were due to leave Shoreham, England last August for Broome, Australia, in a 14-ton ketch, a journey that's expected to be most eventful when word is received of it. End of article.